Should I?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. Welcome all of you to the first session of the symposium entitled South Asia, the Past and the Present. The esteemed speakers for this session are Mr. Prabhat Patnaik, Mr. Saeed Naqvi, Madam Purvashi Bhutalia from New Delhi. The session will be chaired by Professor Ganesh Devi. I heartily welcome all of you. The first speaker of this session is Professor Prabhat Patnaik. He is an Indian economist and political commentator and a former professor at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning in the School of Social Sciences at JNU. A Rhodes Scholar himself, Professor Patnaik has specialization in macroeconomics and political economy, the areas in which he has written a number of books and articles, and is largely known particularly for his advocacy of measures to directly improve the lives of the poor. I request Professor Patnaik to deliver his thoughts on capitalism in South Asia. Dr. Patnaik.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude that I have been asked to speak at this symposium. The topic is capitalism in South Asia, but as a matter of fact, I would not be talking so much about capitalism in the past or the different phases of capitalism as they have manifested themselves in South Asia, but I'd be talking much more about contemporary capitalism and how it affects the South Asian countries. And also, I would not be speaking so much about the pandemic, because we all know that the pandemic has brought enormous hardships to the people in general and to the working people. And while I may occasionally refer to it, I would not talk about the pandemic per se, because I want to argue that there is a great misconception about the impact of capitalism on the South Asian countries, a misconception which is quite independent of the pandemic. This misconception is about what the South Asian countries had witnessed even before the pandemic, which of course has worsened it. We all know, for instance, that during the pandemic, countries have got into, particularly South Asian countries, have got into massive balance of payments crisis. Sri Lanka is having a huge economic crisis because it does not have the foreign exchange to even import food. We all know that Pakistan is having a huge economic crisis, and that as a result, the pandemic, because of the lockdown and slowing down of the world economy in these particular years, has brought great hardships. But I want to really talk about the period before the pandemic. Now, the misconception I was referring to is something like the following. It says that, look, these countries had, before the adoption of what is called reforms, which basically refers to neoliberal policies, which were adopted in India, for instance, in 1991, elsewhere on different dates. But before the adoption of reforms, these countries had been stagnant. But with the adoption of reforms, which means with the adoption of neoliberal capitalism, they have not only experienced very high rates of GDP growth of gross domestic product, but they have also lifted millions of people out of poverty. In other words, implicitly, there's a critique of the Nehruvian period of Nehruvian strategy, which lasted long after Nehru had departed. But nonetheless, there's a critique of what I would call the dirigist strategy that preceded neoliberalism. And the suggestion is that with neoliberalism, you actually find millions being lifted out of poverty with high growth rate and so on. Now, this is a very common impression that people have. This is there in the media, this is there among academics, and this is an impression which is also advocated internationally by agencies like the World Bank, IMF, and so on. They all argue along exactly these lines. Then there is a rider to this, which is sometimes added in the case of specific countries. In India, for instance, the argument is that, look, of late, because of a number of destructive measures, economically destructive measures the Modi government introduced, such as demonetization, such as, for instance, the goods and services tax. You find that people's hardships had increased, the growth rate had come down. In other words, the idea is, and the pandemic added to it. So the idea is that neoliberalism or neoliberal capitalism was fine, but it is Modi which actually spoiled the picture, and the pandemic added to this spoiled picture by further spoiling it. Now, I have no quarrel with the fact that Modi did spoil the picture. Demonetization was a blunder. Likewise, the introduction of GST was something which necessarily affected what I would call the petty production sector, which employs 85% or more of India's total workforce. And that sector was really very adversely affected by the GST. Units which did not pay taxes earlier were suddenly asked to pay. For instance, the Banarasi sari weavers never paid taxes earlier, indirect taxes, but suddenly they're called upon to pay. So obviously this is, and all this is quite apart from the fact that there was a whole paraphernalia of forms that had to fill in and so on, and also paraphernalia of legal advice, all of which added to the cost of petty producers. And therefore, this actually very seriously, very adversely affected that sector. There is no doubt, therefore, that the last few years in India at any rate and elsewhere as well, there have been measures which have led to a worsening of the situation. But the argument is that nonetheless, the entire neoliberal period lifted millions of people out of poverty. Now, this impression, I submit, is wrong. It is wrong because I believe that while the poverty ratio certainly did not increase in the period of Nehruvian economic policies, this poverty ratio has actually increased significantly in the neoliberal period. In other words, in the period of neoliberal capitalism, which is the contemporary capitalism, you have, together with an acceleration in the GDP growth rate, a worsening, an accentuation, an increase in the ratio of poverty-afflicted population in the total population. And the most obvious evidence of this, because this goes so much against what is written about in the media and so on South Asia, that I would like to take a bit of time explaining this. That you see, take India, for instance. In India, poverty studies began in 1973-74. In 1973-74, it was decided by the Planning Commission that anyone in rural India who did not have access to 2,400 calories per person per day should be considered poor, and anyone in urban India who did not have access to 2,100 calories per person per day was to be considered poor. Now, while actually making estimates, the Planning Commission lowered the 2,400 to 2,200. So since then, the idea was that 2,200 was the norm for defining poverty in rural India and 2,100 the norm for defining poverty in urban India. So fine. We have every 5 years a national sample survey, which was designed by Prashanta Mahalanobis. One of the most impressive, is probably the largest, certainly the largest sample survey anywhere in the world. Very impressive set of statistics come out, and millions of researchers have used it over the years in order to do research on the Indian economy. If you look at those statistics, then you find that the proportion of people who were in rural India below 2,200 calories did not increase between 1973-74 and 1993-94. 1993-94 is the first post-liberalization sample survey, large sample survey. no increase in it. But if you take the period after 1993-4, there is a significant increase in the proportion of the population that does not have access to 2,200 calories per person per day in rural India. Just to give two endpoints, 58% of the population in 1993-94 fell below 2,200 calories per person per day. Today, the latest survey was 2011-12, when the proportion went up to 68%. Now, this is in the period of neoliberal growth. And what is more, you also find that after 2011-12, the next sample survey was 2017-18, where the findings were so dismal that the Modi administration decided to suppress that survey. That survey's results have not been released, even though some newspapers produced some leaked out results. But on the other hand, not only did the Modi administration not release the results, but they in fact have decided to discontinue the National Sample Survey in the old form. Apparently, it showed that in 2017-18, per capita rural consumption expenditure in real terms, it's per capita, not just for the poorest, but per capita actually fell by 9%, which is unprecedented between 2011-12 and 17-18. Now, exactly the same you find, for instance, in Bangladesh, which has been generally cited as a success story under neoliberal capitalism. There is talk about millions in Bangladesh having been lifted out of poverty. You look at 2010, the percentage considered to be in poverty in Bangladesh was about 35%. And by 2016, 6 years, this is supposed to have come down to 21%. But exactly in that period, there has been a decline in the calorie intake. In fact, this is generally referred to as a calorie puzzle in Bangladesh. So the point is that if people are becoming hungrier, if hunger is increasing, in that case, how can you say poverty is declining? As a matter of fact, you find that the poverty is increasing. But then why do they find these results about millions being lifted out of poverty? Because what they do is that there is a poverty line, which is $1.90 per day. And of course, that poverty line is periodically brought up to date by using a consumer price index number. And those who do not have that much of expenditure per day are considered poor. Now, the problem is that this bringing up to date is where the problem lies, because in between what you have had is privatization of education, privatization of health services. Now, when you have privatization of health services, that does not, and obviously private healthcare is far more expensive than government healthcare. We know from lots of newspaper reports about farmers from UP, from adjoining areas coming to Delhi because their father is ill or something, child is ill, paying through their noses and even selling their land in order to look after the child's health and so on, and at the end of it, even the child doesn't even survive. So there are lots of such tragic stories. Private healthcare is far more expensive, but it does not figure in the consumer price index inflation, because technically, inflation simply refers to what is the price rise. And the price rise for healthcare in the old days, when there was more of government hospitals and so on, or more access to government hospitals, let us say it was 1 rupee then, and suppose it has gone up to 2 rupees now, then you find that there's a 100% rise in prices. But government hospitals themselves have really disappeared from the scene, more or less, and that you go to a private hospital paying 5 rupees for the same service, and therefore there's effectively a 400% rise in prices, but that would not figure in your consumer price index. Because of which you find that there is an underestimation of inflation, and exactly the same is true in Bangladesh as well. there's an underestimation of inflation, and this underestimation basically implies that more people are shown to have been lifted out of poverty than actually is the case. As a matter of fact, even Bangladeshi economies, India and Bangladesh are supposed to be the success stories of neoliberal capitalism, 7 to 8% GDP growth rate. And in both these countries, what happens is that the more expensive that education, healthcare, and services have become because of privatization, people skimp on their consumption in order to meet those expenses, and therefore you have a worsening of poverty together with a rise in the GDP. And this is something which is also theoretically to be expected. Why do I say that? Because what neoliberalism does is that, look, I mean, under neoliberalism, what happens is that contemporary capitalism is one where there is relative freedom of movement of commodities and capital, particularly finance, across countries. This was not the case earlier. Under the Bretton Woods system that was there earlier, every country imposed quantitative restrictions on imports. Every country really had very strong restrictions on financial flows across borders and even on capital flows across borders. And therefore, this contemporary capitalism is characterized by relatively free movements of goods and services and of capital and finance across borders. Now, when this happens, finance, in short, has become globalized. At one telephone call, finance can move from India to Poland or to Hungary or to Pakistan or anywhere, just with one telephone call. You can have large movements. Because of the globalization of finance, which confronts a nation state, because the states are all nation states, you actually have a situation where the nation state, the government of the nation state, willy-nilly has to do the biddings of finance. If a government does something which goes against the dictates or the wishes or the demands of finance, then large amounts of finance would flow out of that country. And if so, then the country would be stuck in a crisis. Therefore, you find that increasingly the governments do what globalized finance wants them to do. This is a situation that, for instance, the well-known economist of the 20th century, John Maynard Keynes, had warned against. He had actually said that finance, above all, must be national. But on the other hand, with globalized finance, finance really runs the show. This has very important implications for democracy and so on. For instance, you may elect a government which is different from the government that exists, and that government may even promise that, look, we are going to do things differently, but as a matter of fact, when it is elected to power, as long as it is in the grip of financial flows, it would do more or less exactly the same thing that the earlier government was doing in the matter of the economy. You look at Greece, for instance. Syriza was really elected on the promise of doing something very differently, but because Syriza was more or less trapped into doing the biddings of finance, because Greece did not come out of the EU's financial arrangement, you actually found that Syriza was doing exactly the same thing as the previous governments were doing. So it has important implications for democracy and so on, which I'm not going to go into. But on the other hand, one of the things it does is that the state does not support peasant agriculture the way it was doing before, does not support the petty production sector the way it was doing before. In India, for instance, in the petty production sector, as you know, a certain amount of cloth was reserved for the decentralized sector, handloom and powerloom. But on the other hand, that policy no longer exists, all these reservations. And likewise, for peasant agriculture, there has been across the board a withdrawal of support. In India, the residual support which the government provides to peasant agriculture in the form of minimum support price, they were trying to withdraw recently through those three infamous farm laws, against which the peasants had a year-long agitation because of which the government has temporarily actually withdrawn from that position. They have not given up the agenda. Exactly the same in Bangladesh, for instance, or in other South Asian countries, Sri Lanka, that you actually find that there is a withdrawal of government support from the petty production sector and from peasant agriculture. This has two implications. Firstly, the per capita output of food grains and other agricultural goods does not increase. And secondly, the profitability of agriculture, the incomes of the farmers, per capita incomes of the farmers is something which actually begins to decline. And this has happened across the board all over South Asia. One implication of this is that in India, of course, we know the implications of this in terms of large numbers of peasant suicides, almost 3 lakh suicides in the last 25 years. But on the other hand, you find that another implication is substantial migration that has taken place from the countryside to the towns in search of jobs, because of the fact that in the countryside, there has been a squeeze on peasant incomes. But in the towns, the other implication of neoliberalism is that there are no jobs. And why is that an implication of neoliberalism? Because of the fact that if you have free flow of goods across country boundaries, in that case, for your industry to survive, it must not be that they become higher cost compared to, let's say, industry from elsewhere, compared to, say, industry from China, compared to, say, industrial goods from Europe. And because of that, they also have to introduce technological progress at a rate that is sufficiently high to remain competitive in the world economy. If you have a protected market, then there's no compulsion to introduce technological progress. But on the other hand, if you have an open market, then there is an enormous compulsion to introduce technological progress. Now, this is supposed to be a good thing. Most people would say, there you see, because of the fact that we have opened our borders now to the free flow of goods, we have become competitive, we have become technologically more modern, our methods of producing, the products we produce are much more modern than before. But the implication of it is that suppose you have an 8% growth rate. If an 8% growth rate is accompanied by a 7% growth rate in labor productivity, because most technological progress is really labor saving, if 8% GDP growth rate is accompanied by a 7% increase in labor productivity, then the rate of growth of employment, remember, employment times labor productivity is equal to output. So if 8% is the output growth rate and 7% is labor productivity growth rate, then employment growth rate is 1%. Now, oddly enough, during the period of dirigist or Nehruvian economic strategy, when our GDP growth rate was 3.5 to 4% per annum, and everybody says, oh, how awful, employment growth rate was about 2%. Since then, our GDP growth rate has doubled to about 7 to 8%, but on the other hand, employment growth rate has halved to about 1% per annum, which is less than the growth rate of the workforce, let alone absorbing the distressed peasants migrating from the countryside. As a result, the distressed peasants who migrate from the countryside simply swell labor reserves in towns. And when that happens, a given number of jobs are then shared out among more people, which leads to an increase in poverty all around. Because given, casualization of employment, if the same amount of jobs are actually distributed among two people, let us say, or more people, then of course per capita, the income earned by each tends to go down. And what is more, it also has a baneful effect on the purchase, on the bargaining strength of even that tiny proportion of workers who are really organized in the form of trade unions and so on. Therefore, the working people as a whole, starting from the peasantry, and of course, when the peasantry suffers, so do agricultural laborers, going right up to the urban workers, all of them get impoverished in the period of economic liberalization. And this is manifest By impoverished, I mean in real terms, and this is manifest in terms of their reduced consumption. Therefore, in other countries, but there's a more general point which I'd like to make here. Say in countries, many people, and my Bangladeshi economist friends, for instance, they say, oh, but in Bangladesh, lots of employment is growing. I mean, employment is growing. Lots of employment is being created because of, let us say, the growth in the garments industry, because Bangladesh is a major garments exporter. But you see, the problem is that when you are a major garments exporter, your wages cannot increase, because if your wages increase, then those who buy your garments would then switch to some other country. They would switch to some other country where wages are not rising. Therefore, no country can experience a rise in wages for its working people, and not just with the exhaustion of its own labor reserves, but with the labor reserves in other third world countries also getting exhausted. In other words, it's not enough that you have a high rate of employment before your wages start rising, which is what everybody expects. But your wages can only rise when not just you, but every other country also has an exhaustion of its labor reserves. For all these reasons, you actually find that there is no increase in real wages. Not, I mean, no noticeable increase in real wages in town. There is a worsening of the real incomes in the countryside. So altogether, this is a period which is accompanied by, no doubt, a high growth rate, but also by increase in absolute poverty, and therefore substantial increase in inequality. Everybody knows that inequalities have been rising. Recently, the Oxfam report came out. So the rise in inequalities is not just during the pandemic, it has been going on for a very long time. In fact, Piketty has got figures which show that actually in India, the share of the top 1%, they use income tax data. Income tax in India was introduced in 1922. That the share of the top 1% in the total national income, which had actually gone down to about 6% in 1982, which is the lowest it has been, has then started rising and is now about 22%, which is the highest it has ever been since the introduction of income tax in 1922. Therefore, we know that there is a rise in income inequality, rise in wealth inequality, but all this manifests itself in terms of the fact that high growth rate as such is nothing to celebrate about, because it's accompanied by an increase in poverty. The last point I want to make is that even this pattern of growth, even this kind of growth is no longer capable of being sustained. Leave aside the pandemic. And the fact that it's not capable of being sustained was becoming obvious and manifest even before the pandemic. And the reason is very simple. Taking the world as a whole, and mind you, this is happening not just in India. The rise in inequality is a worldwide phenomenon. Taking the world as a whole, you find that wages are not rising, because even American wages now are linked to the third world labor reserve. They cannot rise if the third world is full of labor reserves, unemployed persons, because then industry can always shift to the third world where the wages are much lower. So you find that every country's workers are now tied, their wages are tied to the third world labor reserves. Therefore, wages are not rising anywhere. Stiglitz had actually stated that between 1968 and 2011, the real wages of an American male worker actually marginally declined. Now, you can imagine that is a very serious phenomenon of fact. But productivity rises everywhere. Therefore, the surplus rises the proportion of GDP. And with the rise in surplus, that means there is a shift from wages to surplus in income distribution. At the margin, a wage earner would consume much more out of his income than a surplus earner. And therefore, there is a general tendency towards what Marx had called overproduction or stagnation. In other words, consumption as a proportion of GDP tends to drop. There's no reason why investment should make up for it, because investment increases only when the markets are growing, and therefore the tendency is for stagnation to set in, which it was doing after 2008 and which it has done after 2008. Even in America, which is supposed to have recovered, if you really look at the labor force participation rates, they have tended to drop, which is called the discouraged worker effect. And that being the case, this slowing down is going to affect countries of South Asia, as well as other countries, very, very seriously. And there is no prospects of a recovery. In the United States, the Biden administration, after it came to power, was trying to stimulate the economy in very many ways. But on the other hand, we know that there is an increase in inflation rate in the United States, because of which monetary policy is becoming tighter there, and fiscal policy too is going to become tighter, which is then going to thwart the recovery even in the United States, which means the world recovery, and that in turn would have its impact on South Asia as well. Therefore, contemporary capitalism, I believe, has really hurt South Asia quite seriously, and this hurt that it has caused to the South Asian economies, far from getting over, is something which is going to persist in the coming days, in the coming months and years, because I do not see any immediate way out of it. I think I better stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Patnaik, for such an analytical critique on capitalism in South Asia in the contemporary times, and making us aware of how the economical facts are affecting the South Asia scenario. The next resource person for this session is a well-known Indian journalist, popularly known as a man born for journalism, Mrs. Saeed Naqvi. Besides being a reporter and a columnist on domestic politics, he is known to be the flag bearer of journalism on international relations in India. He is the first of all who started TV interviews and documentaries on global leaders and issues, and interviewed world statesmen like Fidel Castro, Mikhail Gorbachev, Saddam Hussein, Benazir Bhutto, Nelson Mandela, and many more. He has also been active in war journalism, covering from 1971 war to Syrian civil war in 2011. Please welcome Mr. Saeed Naqvi to speak on the topic, Taliban in Afghanistan, the changing dynamics of South Asia. Mr. Naqvi.
Thank you very much. A talk from someone like me expands to fill the time available for its completion. I have distorted Peter principle because I'm well aware of my limitations. I'm a journalist. A journalist is everything by starts and nothing long. Profession is inherently superficial. Therefore, I'm intimidated when you place me in the same gallery as Prabhat just now and Ramada Thapar and others, because I am humbled by their erudition and their focus on a subject. Yes, having been in the business for so many years, one does retain I'll give you an example. I was reminded that there was a seminar today because I had been alerted a month ago. Last night, I was writing my column on Ukraine. Now, what has Ukraine got to do with India, you might ask? Well, if I were to twist it around, there is a great connection, and I shall come to that. Before that, my column was on Boris Johnson's boozy parties at number 10, and therefore his imminent departure from the gaddi of the Prime Minister. Does that have anything to do with India? You know, you'd be surprised how, yes, the two things can be linked. And let me come to Ukraine first. I'm just thinking on my feet, as it were. Yesterday, day before yesterday, I read front page story that India is not saying anything on the Ukraine crisis because if it came out against the Russians, then the Russians will get closer to the Chinese, who we don't like. Now that was front page Indian Express, 3-column headline in Delhi. Now, before we get to the absurdity of it, let me give you another. August of 15, when the Americans were leaving Afghanistan, just when the Americans left, so did we. All the other embassies were opened except our embassy, because we had thrown our lot entirely with Ghani, Ashraf Ghani's government, who was a protege, or in fact, a puppet of the Americans during their last years of occupation. We left because we were with them. Today, China was also involved there. China has a border with Afghanistan. But here, we are hesitating. We are not doing the Americans' bidding. So what does that show to you? That gives you a little clue to day after tomorrow. We are maybe, possibly easing ourselves out of the American lap, as it were. Boris Johnson, what has his boozy party got to do with India? Let me tell you, give you the link. United States of America and Great Britain both have at the moment leaders who are virtually at the edge of their seats. I mean, they have found the Prime Minister. I shouldn't be saying it. I have the courage to say it only because I am quoting British newspapers. British newspapers call him a liar. British newspapers call him unreliable. British newspapers call him the sorts of names that even I hesitate from an adjective that I would use against him. And he was found with a party during pandemic when the rest of the country was asked to stay at home, social distancing, masks, all the restraints. A party of 40 or more was being organized in the lawns of number 10, and there's a subject of a great inquiry. In America, you have a president who already, where Trump has caught up with him and is 0.1% behind him in the ratings, where they are talking of, Economist is mentioning the term like civil war conditions, where pandemic is running rampant, where 7% inflation is gnawing at the presidency because the midterm elections are coming. Now, why have the people selected these two countries? Now, both these countries had rank winners as candidates before their respective elections. If you read the newspapers earlier, you find that Jeremy Corbyn was the most popular man in British politics just a few months before the elections. Likewise, for 2 terms running, Bernie Sanders was the most popular. This is not me, this is American data. This is British data. What I'm quoting is from The Guardian for Boris Johnson and from Fox News of all the newspapers for Sanders. Sanders was the most popular man. But the establishments, the British and the American, the Western establishment, they did not want anybody, because don't forget, the soul of McCarthyism still lingers, lives there. Sanders was considered something of a socialist. Socialist is very close to communist, and communist is anathema because Venezuela Chavez was a communist. Same thing here. What was against Jeremy Corbyn? He was a friend of Chavez of Venezuela. Charges against him were that he was anti-Semitic, which he was not. All the studies showed, there's a book that came out, and now people are writing. Why am I giving you these examples? Examples I'm giving you that if we have the system that we have at the moment, it is people have been reduced to, have been manipulated into pressing buttons, into pushing papers in the ballot boxes. Then before that, the big business, the corporates take over. The corporates, friends, control all the spaces of the media, more or less. A few Ravish Kumars and so on here and there. All the spaces are controlled by the corporates. The corporates have a deal with the powers that are coming in or the powers that are there. What is the deal? We will give you complete, total free run of media support. You tilt the policy on this issue and that issue for us. That is how our current democracy, the crisis of democracy, crisis of electoral democracy everywhere. And at the bottom of it, of course, is the economy, which Professor Patnaik was talking about. Now, let me move away from this little image, which is a spontaneous. This is what journalists, this is the problem of us in our profession. I just went back to the thing that I had written day before yesterday. Afghanistan. Let us take the cutoff date of Afghanistan as the Saur Revolution of 1978. Saur is April. April 6th, the revolution took place, which brought the government of Nur Muhammad Taraki, a communist. There were 2 communist parties of Afghanistan, the Parcham and the Khalq. The Khalq was more like the CPI, and the Parcham was more like the CPM. And Taraki became the communist prime minister. I was there for his first press conference. Now, how did that happen? That happened because of a completely botched up effort of SAVAK, which is the Shah's of Iran's intelligence agency, which wanted to snuff out all the left elements around President Dawood, with whom himself the Americans were not very comfortable. He was surrounded by leftists, and therefore a plan was hatched that the left would be eliminated physically, and that's it. The plan got leaked. What happened? A man called Mir Akbar Khyber of the Parcham party, who was a trade union leader, he got murdered, and the story leaked that some kind of a SAVAK, a secret operation is on. The communists got wind of it. They went into the presidential palace, killed Dawood and all his paraphernalia, and that is how the communists came to power. The minute they came to power, my God, there was, communism is right there in Afghanistan. So antibodies began to work, and the CIA got very active. And by 1979 December, things were bad enough for one of the, I think it was Barbara Karmal, who in fact invited the Russian troops rolled in. Oh, that is the beginning. That is the beginning of all our goals. How Russians have got in, so the Russians have to be evicted. How? I remember Mr. Brzezinski right there, gone to Pakistan, and he said, that somehow that has to be rolled back. A scheme was formed. What was the scheme? Americans would train them, Saudis would spend the money, and Pakistani territory and specialization, and therefore Mujahideen. Remember terrorism? We are talking about terrorism. It was manufactured in Afghanistan by way of the Mujahideen. And the Mujahideen were given these Stinger missiles by the Americans. Pakistan opened 175 odd madrasas in one little stretch, thousands all over the place. Madrasas on the Afghan-Pakistan border, on the Pakistani side, which became hatcheries for the kind of Islam that would there were three interests involved. Let me give you those three interests. The interests were, the Americans wanted the Soviets out, simple. The Saudis, who were putting in all the money, Naif was then the crown prince, all the money and direction. They had a bigger interest. In 1978 itself, 79, the Iranian revolution had brought the Ayatollahs to power. My God, the Shias had come to power there. So who have a long border with Afghanistan. So if we can create a Wahhabized Islam in Afghanistan, that will act as a bulwark against the Shia Iran. That was the Saudi interest. What was Ziaul Haq's interest? Ziaul Haq said, my God, here is my chance. Nizam-e-Mustafa, this composite culture that you talk about, this was a big irritant. So long as we keep talking about the composite culture, the subcontinent, Pakistan, would always be ensnared by this concept, this overarching concept. We have to wrench ourselves away from whatever composite culture there is in us. We have to Arabize. We have to look west. Islam was going to be Arabized. This was the plan. And of course, what happened? It's a very long story. Let me bring you up to date. Fast forward to present times. When Americans moved in 20 years ago, they had been there for much before that. First, they thought, you'll be surprised at the similarities between Afghanistan and Ukraine. The other one was that at that time, Unicol, a big company, had a plan to bring gas from Turkmenistan via Afghanistan, Pakistan to India. TAPI, it was called. TAPI. Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Americans, it was an American company. America is run by big conglomerates. And this, so therefore, we shall, in about the 90s, we shall allow the Taliban to overrun Afghanistan, to control Afghanistan, and we, the Americans, shall control them. What happened? Why did it not happen? A lady called Christiane Amanpour turned up in Kabul because there was such huge American interest. She saw the Taliban treating the women rather shabbily. So she wrote 2 or 3 stories about, there were shows on it, a serial in American television, CNN. I remember I was with Richard Holbrooke in Delhi, and he had got a call here in Delhi. We were talking at some function. He got a call from, as he was the Deputy Secretary of State and Ambassador to the UN for the Clinton administration. He came to me, he said, it's all over. I said, what is over? The Taliban, as an American interest, have been dismissed because Christiane has done these stories about women being maltreated and shabbily treated in Pakistan. So that is how that went. Then the Americans directly came in. For 20 years, they said they were training the army. When they left, can you believe it? The richest country in the world remained in occupation of Afghanistan for 20 years. And when it left, we are told that 23 million people are on the verge of starvation. 20 years of American occupation. What were you doing there? Oh, the army. We actually trained the army rather badly. They should have been trained differently. They are different people. Where is that 300,000 army? Where are those arms? But we were with them at that time. Now, the whole dynamics in South Asia is changing. Imagine yourself with a tennis racket. The guts of the racket here in the middle. This is where Afghanistan is, and this is where the Americans were. The rim is Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, a little interior, China, Russia, and Kyrgyzstan. Now while the Americans were here in the middle, we were comfortable. But now that the Americans have got do samandar udhar, beyond 2 oceans, now we are here. We have no alternative but to make peace in this. We have no alternative. Mark my word, on this seminar, once these elections end, already things have started happening. You will have a completely new dynamics will be initiated. There is no alternative. But The problem is one. Supposing it involves, to just as a final thing, let me show you the problem of South Asia in two little ops of mine. These are homemade ops. I call it the problem of the interlocking triangles. The problem of the interlocking triangles. What is the problem? We have a very stout and a very old caste structure. The caste structure is, you've got the Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and then as you go down, it becomes wider and wider like this. This was exposed to notions of democracy, equity, social justice, upward mobility. So it became a little wobbly. Came VP Singh, he put a boulder in the pond, and tsunami happened. And the counter tsunami, which was the Rath Yatra, and you had the Mandal, Kamandal, that spiral is at its peak now. What was the Kamandal? The Kamandal was this second triangle. Let me show you this triangle. If you can tell it, this is, according to me, the solution. India, this triangle, India, Pakistan, Hindu, Muslim, New Delhi, Srinagar. This is one triangle. This is one complex of issues. You touch any one side of this triangle and the other two are immediately affected, as happens in geometry. Supposing anyone who says that he's charging off to Pakistan, to Kashmir to solve the problem, he's telling a lie, because he cannot. You will have to bring in Pakistan somewhere, willy-nilly, despite the bifurcation. You will have to bring in Pakistan. Once you bring in Pakistan, this here, this line will collapse. This line will collapse. Hindu-Muslim temperatures will come down. Hindu-Muslim temperatures will come down. Mark my word. Hindu-Muslim temperatures will come down. If they come down, what happens to Hindu consolidation, which is how it happens to this consolidation then? So this is the trap that we are in. This is the trap, which I call the interlocking triangles. These two triangles are interlocked. The problem is not, and one day, any day, we open up with Pakistan, we open up a little bit. Very interesting. I gave you the story that India cannot be seen to be supporting Americans on Ukraine, because otherwise Russia will get closer, as if we would have they already are like this, Russians and in every possible way. This is the story in Indian Express. Before that, I read, listen to this. India-China trade exceeds 136 billion, the highest trade we've ever had with China. So what is going on? There's something else is happening here, and something else that we do know. There is something that is being played out in the political arena, in the social arena, and there's something else has been going on quietly. And that reality can very easily assert itself too. Finally, on the current problems, remember, this is my humble formulation. I have just written a play. It's called The Muslim Vanishes. I'm not propagating the book. It has just come out by Penguin. It is already on the, it's done well. It's done very well. Read it. What is the theme? Theme is this. Very simple, which we have not been able to decipher. Communalism in India has political patronage. Communalism in India has political patronage. Caste in India has long and ancient social acceptability. It is an ancient social habit. So now you're juxtaposing, you're using one triangle to manage the other triangle. You see, that is the trap in which our ruling elite is. But the realities on the ground realities are Americans now more or less going into their laga. British, you've seen what your European unity in total disarray. What is happening is that instead of the Quad that we are supposed to be, no one talks about the Quad anymore, because the Quad that has taken over are the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians and Pakistan and others in the rim of Afghanistan, where we have to be. And it was a good initiative that just the other day, the Prime Minister spoke to 4 or 5 leaders of Central Asian republics, who in fact, remember that for 2 years, we've had the following guests at our 26th January parade. Last year, we had Mr. Bolsonaro of Brazil, who was in all sorts of trouble at home, legally and otherwise. He will not be returned. This year, we had invited 5 leaders from Central Asia, not Pakistan, not Iran, but all the others. They did not come. The reason was COVID. So this is the first, I hope, this is the first time that our Republic Day was celebrated, observed, without any VIP. New things are happening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for your analysis of dynamics of the world politics and Afghanistan from the meticulous journalistic eye and bringing before our eyes the factual account of the Afghanistan scenario. Thank you, Mr. Naqvi. As the next speaker of this session, we are indeed privileged to have Madam Purvashi Bhutalia, an Indian feminist, writer, publisher, and activist. She is known for her work in the women's movement of India, as well as for authoring books on partition and Kashmir. She was the co-founder of Kali for Women, India's first feminist publishing house in 1984, and founder of Zuban Books in 2003, that were set up to increase the body of knowledge on women in the third world, to give voice to such knowledge as already exists and provide a forum for women writers, creative, and academics. Having main interest in the area of partition and oral stories from a feminist perspective, Purvashi Bhutalia will be delivering her speech on the topic on the experience of partition. Madam Purvashi Bhutalia.
Thank you, Arundhati, and thank you very much to Shivaji University and to Megha for inviting me to speak here today. I'm honored to be on a panel with Prabhat and Saeed, and to have Professor Ganesh Devi, someone whose work I really admire, as a chair of our session. So what I'm going to say to you is going to be very, very different from the 2 presentations you just heard. It is a much smaller, although the moment I'm talking about is a large historical moment in our history, but I'm going to focus on something really small. And I'm going to be speaking to you about partition. And as all of you know, we live currently in a strange moment where partition is simultaneously all around us. And yet it is also in an odd kind of way forgotten. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that certain aspects of it are forgotten. So for me, partition wasn't only the actual division that happened on or around the 15th of August, it was also what preceded it and what follows it. And so much of what came before partition are things that have been referred to by the previous two speakers and also in the morning by Romila and Dr. Devi, which were the precious friendships, the living together with difference, the belongingness in which religion had a place, but it wasn't the preeminent place. This has all but been forgotten, and it is the occasional story such as that of the two brothers, Sikka Khan and Sadiq Khan, being united after 70 years that has been so much in the news that brings this kind of thing back. So I don't want to make the classic mistake of painting the past in rosy colors. For what preceded partition was also the ugliness of terrible inequality of caste and class, and yes, of religion. And what followed it, and which still continues, is on the one hand, a fading desire to revisit old homes and meet old friends and put a closure on things that were left hanging for people. And on the other, a replaying of the hatred and the terrible violence directed in particular against the Muslims, on whom all blame for partition having happened is heaped, and more so today. The escalation of this kind of violence and its tacit sanctioning by the powers that be is also, I think, what pushes us to look again at partition and to ask what lessons that moment offers us. So because of the selective recalling of partition today, and because of the instrumentalization of these partial memories into actual violence, not only in our country, but also in Pakistan and Bangladesh, I want today to do something different, to recall something different, to recall something that speaks of what is possible, something that can perhaps in these dark times give us hope. As you know, the last 2 decades have seen a great deal of work on partition, not only in the Punjab, but across the country. In the East, in the Northeast, in Gujarat, in Ladakh, in Kashmir, and so much more. So one might legitimately ask, is there anything more left to say? Are we reaching a point where everything that had to be said about partition has already been said? And the obvious answer to that question is no, because a history as complex and complicated as that of the partition can't be easily done and dusted. Even a cursory look at the past few years shows the way in which partition histories have taken on new directions, with new people coming in and reopening those histories. So for example, there is now much more work that actually crosses borders. Earlier, this work was contained within borders because of political reasons, but today anthologies, essays, graphic narratives, artworks put together, sometimes collaboratively by people across borders, are taking place. The earlier studies, which were often very specific, focused, detailed, remained confined within the boundaries of one nation, mainly because of the political constraints that do not allow us to do cross-border research. These have now begun to open up, and as they do, they offer us the possibility of connecting what happened in our region with wider histories across the world. So for example, partition refugees did not only move within South Asia, but also to other parts of the world, and they carried their stories with them. Now, in this day and age, it is their children and grandchildren who, as they travel across the world, as they populate academic spaces abroad, they take these legacies with them and often share them in very, very interesting spaces. Within our own spaces, let's say even within India in different places, as academia becomes receptive and more receptive to, within quotes, other histories, lesser known histories across the world, the stories of partition too have entered different disciplines. And with people, with academics, they travel across borders and time as only stories can do. In doing so, they confound the attempts of our states to contain these histories within our borders, as if those histories belonged only to a particular country. It is today clear that the multiple histories of partition, which today new research is also locating in the aftermath of the many displacement and settlements across the world, resettlements across the world that came as a result of the world wars. So today it's clear that these histories of partition can no longer be contained within national boundaries. And indeed, among recent developments, let us not forget the internet and YouTube and Instagram and all of the other things on social media, which have been created by the internet, that have ensured that the 75-year-old attempt to contain these histories within national borders is no longer feasible. One of the ironies, I think, is that the history that attempted to draw borders and contain us inside those borders has today, especially with the coming of the internet, spilled far beyond those borders. So Zoom discussions, webinars, online classes, lectures on YouTube, organizations like Punjabi Leher, whose mission is to carry stories that unite the two Punjabs, all of these contribute to this. Personally, for example, in the last few years, I have found myself often lecturing to students in Pakistan using the internet and being able to enter their classes and talk about partition in ways that was simply not possible before. So it's with this in mind that I'm going to offer you here, for the remaining part of my talk, a few stories of cross-border connections to emphasize not only that this is a shared history, but also in this time of despair to give us hope that the lessons that we learn from people's everyday lives, from their stories, from how they fought the darkness and despair around them, and our lessons that can sustain us as we walk into an uncertain future. These stories are not new. I've written and spoken about them before, and I apologize if you may have heard one or other of them earlier, but I thought in today's context, they would be interesting to raise. So I'm going to tell you 3 stories. This is my first story. In Karachi in 2017, at a literature festival, I met an 85-year-old woman called Shehnaz. She told us a little bit of her story, and later I visited her home, and she and her children together told me the story of Shehnaz's life. Shehnaz's original name was Guru Bachchan. She was a Sikh young woman of about 16 at the time of partition. As her extended family was trying to flee from imminent violence in the part of Punjab where they lived, which eventually went to Pakistan, they were attacked and many people were killed. Gurbachan and some friends of hers, all young women of roughly the same age, were abducted and taken away, and they did not get to know what happened to their families. They assumed, as many people did, that the families had been killed. Gurbachan's abductor later married her. This was also not uncommon. And in order to marry him, she converted to Islam and became Shehnaz. She and her husband had 5 children, 4 daughters and a son. About 10 or so years after partition, they heard, I think through someone who was visiting, I'm not quite sure of that her parents had actually survived the attack and they were living near Amritsar. So together, she and her husband decided to visit them. And the whole family traveled to India, where there was a great reunion. When it came to time for them to return to Pakistan, Shehnaz's parents refused to let her go. They told her that she could keep her children if she wanted, but that they did not want her to leave with her husband or to live with him. And the reason doesn't require any guesses. He was Muslim, he was Pakistani. And they forcibly kept her back in Amritsar. Her husband left for Pakistan with their 5 children. Shehnaz was now, within quotes, returned to her original identity and original religion. So she became Gurbachan again and became a Sikh again. And later she was married to a widower who had a young son who needed to be looked after. Many years later, her son migrated to the US after her husband died. And here is another partition history crossing another border. And later, Shehnaz Gurbachan, she was now called Gurbachan, went to live with her son in the United States. 50 years had now passed since the separation from her children. In the US with her son, she often spoke of her, again within quotes, original family, and the son suggested they try to find them. Using the internet, he reached out to a paper in Pakistan, a newspaper in Pakistan, put in an advertisement which described the incident and which said a mother was searching for her children. And lo and behold, the children, now adults with children of their own, saw the advertisement and reconnected with their mother after 50 years. When I met her in Karachi, Shehnaz had come to Pakistan to be with her original family and had chosen to become Shehnaz again. She said, "This is my home and my family. This is where I want to live and die." She was on a 3-month visa to Pakistan, which had been given to her on compassionate grounds because of her age. And she was waiting to hear if the government would extend her visa and allow her to live in Karachi with her family till the end of her days. It didn't matter to her what nationality she had. What mattered to her was that she would be close to her children. So from Gurbachan to Shehnaz to Gurbachan to Shehnaz again, from Pakistan to India to Pakistan to India to America to Pakistan, home, family, belonging, citizenship, migration, all of these stories rolled into one life, and a life that is quintessentially neither Indian nor Pakistani, but in many ways, South Asian. A second story that I want to tell you is the story of 2 men called Chaudhry Latif and Harkishan Das Bedi. It begins, however, with the story of a woman called Iqbal Begum. Iqbal Begum lived in a small village called Kher Dikki in Punjab at the time of partition. Like many others in the violence of partition, she lost many members of her family in the move to Pakistan, and this memory continued to haunt her. Years later, it came back once again to haunt her when her grandson wanted to go with a peace delegation to Amritsar. You'll remember that there was a time when there were a large number of delegations of doctors and lawyers and students and activists and others traveling across the 2 countries. This was that moment when he wanted to go on a peace delegation, and she advised him against it, fearing that he would be killed. Now, while this was her experience, she had a daughter, Kulsum. For Kulsum, the story of partition was completely different. She married into a family of a man called Chaudhry Latif, who was a partition refugee who moved to Lahore after partition and was allotted a house in a local area called Islampura, which was earlier known as Krishnanagar. When Chaudhry Latif moved into the house in Islampura, he had no idea about its history. He didn't know that it had previously belonged to a Sikh who in turn had to leave for India at very short notice. And he had been allocated that house. So one day he received a letter in the post addressed simply to the occupant of the house. The letter said, "I write to you as a human being. I hope you will not be put off that a Hindu has written to you. We are human beings first and Hindus and Muslims only after that. I firmly believe that you will oblige me by answering this letter in the name of the human bond we share." The letter went on to describe how its writer Bedi had earlier lived in the same house that Chaudhry Latif now occupied, how he had to leave overnight, leaving behind his precious books and papers. Bedi was a teacher and a writer of school textbooks. Over the years, the two men developed a deep friendship through letters, and they exchanged thoughts and ideas on many things. They helped each other with paperwork, pensions, bank accounts, possessions, and so much more. And then the correspondence ended when one of them died. Years later, in Chaudhry Latif's house, his daughter-in-law found Bedi's letters carefully kept away in a cupboard and shared them. And it is these letters that she used to convince her mother that her brother should travel to India and he would be safe. And he did. My last story is more recent and has to do with partition in a somewhat different way. As you know, in 1971, the two parts of Pakistan created at partition, the East and the West, separated into two countries, Bangladesh and Pakistan. And once again, people had to endure terrible violence, familial separation, deep loss, and so on. I'm not going to go into the politics of this division. That's not my area, and I'm never comfortable talking about large politics. My story is more personal, perhaps more intimate. So between women in South Asia, there have been, over the last 5 or 6 decades at least, very, very deep connections and friendships. When Bangladesh separated from Pakistan, these friendships were profoundly endangered and fractured. I remember that all our friends who were from the two countries suddenly developed animosity and hatred for each other. One winter, I happened to have 2 friends visiting me. One was from Pakistan, the other from Bangladesh. This must have been around 75. My Bangladeshi friend refused to talk to my Pakistani friend. They were both living in my house. She was so full of rage and anger and a sense of injustice. This was not individual to her, and again we found it repeated. Now from there, I want to fast forward to the 30th anniversary of the liberation of Bangladesh in 2001, when a Pakistani-based group called ASER organized a South Asian Women's Conference in Lahore, to which they also invited women from Bangladesh. At the conference, Pakistani women dedicated a full day to Bangladesh to celebrate its independence and give to their Bangladeshi sisters at a people's level something that Bangladeshis had been long asking for, but which the Pakistani state was obviously reluctant to give, an apology for what the Pakistani army had done in Bangladesh in 1971. Many of you will know that Bangladesh has been seeking an official apology, and it hasn't come. Here, it was the women who decided to reach out to their Bangladeshi sisters to apologize and to assert a South Asian solidarity that has, till today, kept those bonds of friendship strong and resilient. As always, it's women who often show the way. I've told you these stories of hope to reiterate what I think all of us already know. The history of partition is not going to go away, and even if its direct survivors have mostly gone, there is so much we can learn from their memories. And I think it's incumbent on us to also find a space to preserve those memories so that that history is not lost to us, and so that we can in some way honor those who bore the brunt of that moment and also bring justice to their memories. I've also told you these stories to reiterate another point, that the darkness that surrounds us today is so all-pervasive that it is difficult to find hope. In the economic scenario that Prabhat painted, it seemed really difficult. Where is the hope going to come from? In what Saeed talked about, I felt much the same. In the political games of the world, what and how are we going to find something to hold on to? So the question is, what sort of future are we heading to? What will we leave behind for our children? These are questions that plague us all the time. For me, at least, when this despair becomes overwhelming, I go back to the stories of partition, of ordinary women, men, of children, of Dalits, of Hijras, of minorities. And I think that if they could survive that moment of such terrible violence and hatred and come out of it with compassion, maybe this is something that we can also try to do. So I will end here. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, madam. Thank you for making us revisit the pangs of partition through stories unknown and making us aware of how a shared history of partition actually connect people, breaking the borders that partition created. Thank you so much. At the end of the session, may I now request Professor Ganesh Devi, a renowned Indian linguist, critic, and educator, to present the remarks of the chair. Professor Devi.
Well, it has been a treat to listen to Professor Patnaik, Mr. Naqvi, and Dr. Bhutalia. Professor Patnaik has drawn our attention to the fact that economic crisis is the current name of South Asia, and we need to do some deep surgery in a comprehensive manner to come out of it, that there are no easy solutions. Mr. Naqvi pointed out to the fact that we're not just a creation of our common ancient past and a mix of cultures, but also international conspiracies, and how much the making of the destinies of these South Asian nations is now entangled with other forces outside South Asia, and how the people of these countries have to be just mere spectators, but without losing hope. And that, I think, that part was, it came through very strongly. And Dr. Purvashi's reminder was once again very useful reminder that South Asia is not just a piece of land, not just a geography, not just a collection of political and economic crises, but also a state of mind and a memoryscape which is much larger and than any single nation, and that memoryscape cannot be wiped out despite tremendous efforts in all nations from the powers that be in dividing people and hardening the boundaries and sharpening the differences. Indeed, in our times, the state has become the villain of the piece in our story of South Asia, and probably deservingly so. And everywhere, this bouncing nationalism is being rubbed into the lives of innocent citizens every day, turning them into hate machines, as in a different sense, the National Security Advisor of India, Mr. Dowell, said civil society is now the fourth generation war is in and through the civil society. I think the civil society, the society at large, the citizenry, they are experiencing a tremendous stress, A, of the artificial divisions between nation and nation, B, between tremendous pressure on them to hate all others and inculcate a sense of identity which is not their sense of identity, and C, a constant fear of intimidation and of having to face violence. Now, in this situation, probably it is up to us, scholars, poets, thinkers, people of working at ground level, to open up, to open dialogues, to look at non-conventional ways of linking minds and peoples. After all, we are, in terms of our numbers, in terms of the natural resources we have, in terms of the cultural and thought traditions that we have at our back, a strong candidate to hope for a better tomorrow. We are almost at the crossroads. One pointer goes to those countries which normally figure in the last 50 in any ranking on health, education, legal system, democratic functioning, in the last 50 of a list of 200 nations. The other goes to a country of the future that was imagined by Gandhi, conceptualized by Ambedkar, for which our freedom fighters fought and laid their lives. I think in South Asia, as never before, there is an abundant alert, urgency, and demand for idealism of a unique kind. Theories will save us. Flow of capital might help us a little bit. But what we need is hope and idealism in order to better our lives and lives of our fellow people in all these countries that make, including Myanmar, which we have silenced in our discourse. We left it out. We leave it unmentioned, and I feel quite sad about it. We need hope and idealism at this juncture because things are very depressing. But we must persist, like Albert Camus would have said in the middle of the war, about which he wrote later in a book like The Plague, that even if plague is there and everybody is fleeing, I must persist on. We must persist on making South Asia better in our terms, not in terms of the Russian astronaut who defined development as phase 1, phase 2, going to other planets and controlling all the energies that the cosmos can produce and becoming like gods. Not in terms of the technology satraps who think of turning us into some kind of man-machine hybrid. We, as successors, inheritors of Homo sapiens who settled in South Asia several millennia ago, need to be like Homo sapiens to keep the Homo sapien intact. 1/4 of the entire world's population needs this. And this was brought out by all three speakers, for me at least, very strongly. I want to thank you. It was an absolute privilege for me personally to listen to Professor Patnaik and Mr. Saeed Naqvi and Uresi Bhutalia. Thank you very much indeed. Bye and have a good day.
Thank you so much, Professor Devi, for your valuable critical remarks, reminding us of the hope and idealism for the better future. I sincerely thank all the esteemed speakers of this session. And with this, we end with the session, only to join for the next session after a break of 10 minutes at Indian Standard Time of 4 p.m. Thank you so much.